You're looking at Nauru, a small island nation in the Pacific Ocean. It's the third smallest country in the world, thousands of miles off the coast of Australia. It's hot, it's humid, and at first glance, even idyllic, the kind of place that people might take a vacation. But if you look closer, this island also holds a dark secret: the Nauru Australian Immigration Detention Centre. This is a prison, and it's where Australia sends its migrants for processing. Anyone who is intercepted by boat traveling to Australia to claim asylum is sent here. Their asylum claims aren't processed on mainland Australia. Instead, they're sent to this far-flung island nation that has been paid off by the Australian government. And this isn't the only deal that they've made. Australia has another refugee prison on Christmas Island, and there was once another prison on the island of Manus in Papua New Guinea. This is what Australian policymakers have referred to as the Pacific Solution. Yikes. It's their way of dealing with refugees without taking any responsibility. The Pacific Solution has these refugees stuck in a kind of legal limbo, trapped in open-air prisons, abandoned by the Australian government for years on end, where they often face abuse and human rights violations. Australia has been at this for years. This process is called border externalization, and what it means is there are secret borders that prevent people from ever reaching the shores of developed countries. It's a policy that's meant to push back enforcement of territory, to place responsibility to protect and process refugees on other countries, usually developing countries. And it's part of a broader attack on asylum seekers led by Western nations. Because Australia isn't alone. More and more, countries don't want to take responsibility for refugees coming to their shores. So, with record numbers of migrants fleeing their home countries in recent years, how is the Western world externalizing their borders to escape asylum law obligations? And what is the effect on people who are seeking safety and a better life? So, to understand why countries would externalize their borders, we need to talk about international law. What is Australia, or the US, or any other country obligated to do to help refugees? Well, the 1967 Convention relating to the status of refugees has very clear rules. In short, signatories agree to not send refugees back to a place where they are at risk of persecution. They agree to give refugees legal rights like access to employment, education, and social security. And they agree to not punish refugees for entering the country illegally. The 1967 Convention was ratified by the vast majority of countries. Every country we're about to talk about, in fact. They agreed to these standards for how to deal with displaced people, and the convention sets a pretty high bar. But if you're a politician or a leader who doesn't want to deal with these refugees, what can you do to get around this international treaty that your country signed decades ago? Well, you externalize your border. You make sure the refugees never get to you in the first place, because if they can't present themselves at a port of entry, the protections never trigger. Or if they make it to your country, you send them on to a third country for processing. It's what Australia does, and unfortunately, they're not alone. Of course, long before the Pacific Solution ever existed, the United States was leading the charge in border externalization. In the late 80s and early 90s, Haiti was facing a major humanitarian crisis and deep political instability. And in response to this, the United States has long maintained a policy of high seas interdiction. They don't process the asylum claims of migrants because the migrants ideally never make landfall. The Coast Guard catches them en route and sends them straight back to Haiti. Under President Clinton, this policy changed slightly. The US Coast Guard tried to do shipboard screening of asylum claims of Haitian migrants, but this was found to be non-viable for some reason. So what did they do instead? They caught them at sea, and then they sent them to Guantanamo Bay for processing. But this wasn't really much of a change. Haitians weren't being screened in Guantanamo to be then resettled in the US. They were merely waiting to be sent back to Haiti again, and at best sent on to a third country. Now, for a more modern taste of US border externalization, you're looking at the town of Tapachula in Chiapas, Mexico. This is one of Mexico's poorest states, and it sits on their southern border with Guatemala. Migrants fleeing violence in Central America pass through here on the way to the United States, where they plan to claim asylum. But the Mexican border force doesn't typically let them pass. Migrants end up stuck in Tapachula in open-air prisons, not dissimilar to conditions on Nauru or Manus. They face violence, lack of economic opportunity, and uncertain futures. The US effectively has a second border force and a second secret border. Under President Trump, the US threatened tariffs on trade with Mexico that would devastate the Mexican economy unless they cracked down on migration at the southern border. This is part of the Remain in Mexico policy, a two-pronged approach under the Trump administration. If they do reach the US, migrants should wait in Mexico while their asylum claims are being processed. But also, the Mexican government should crack down on migration as a whole, preventing migrants from ever presenting themselves at a port of entry in the United States. This has caused one of the biggest human rights crises in recent years.
It will mean that anyone entering the UK illegally, as well as those who have arrived illegally since January the 1st, may now be relocated to Rwanda.
That was Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, talking about a plan that his party created to send anyone seeking asylum in the United Kingdom to Rwanda, a country perhaps best known for brutal genocide and its spotty at best human rights record. Rather than dealing with asylum seekers' claims on their own soil, British politicians plan to cut a deal with the Rwandan government. In exchange for payment, the Rwandan government will process their asylum claims and ideally resettle the refugees in the capital city of Kigali. Boris Johnson and other politicians who support policies like this claim that this is meant to curb illegal migration and keep people safe, while cracking down on black markets designed to help migrants get into more developed nations. And they're not alone in this belief. This is the Spanish enclave of Melilla. This is technically in Morocco, and yet this is considered Spanish land, a little slice of the European Union in Africa. This border is highly militarized, massive fences lined with barbed wire, which are patrolled in equal measure by the Moroccans and the Spanish, because people fleeing violence in North Africa know that if they can cross this gauntlet, they'll be taken to mainland Spain and given the chance to apply for asylum. The European Union pays Morocco hundreds of millions of dollars for the trouble of patrolling this border, despite abuses of migrants on the Moroccan side and dozens of migrant deaths as people try to cross. In fact, the European Union broadly makes border externalization deals with third countries too, just like the United Kingdom. The Libyan Coast Guard prevents migrant vessels from reaching Italy, where, if they made landfall, they would otherwise receive refugee protections. Italy pays handsomely for this protection service, despite reports that migrants are often returned to detention camps in Libya with deplorable conditions, rife with abuse. Turkey and the European Union made a deal in 2016 in response to the Syrian refugee crisis too. Turkey agreed to do everything they can to prevent migrants from passing through their borders into Greece and the European Union more broadly, and any migrants that did make it through could legally be returned to Turkey. And the European Union paid for this service too. $6 billion went to Turkey. And now Erdogan consistently uses the leverage of allowing refugees to pass through as a negotiation tool with the European Union, effectively weaponizing refugees. These policies all have the same hallmarks. Highly developed nations externalize their borders. They send refugees away, or they pay a third country to manage migration for them. They pass responsibility on to a less developed nation via bribery or diplomatic and economic pressure. And they justify this by saying that this is in the interest of safety and discouraging migration. But what are the actual results?
A sweltering summer day in Texas, with temperatures topping 100 degrees, contributing to one of the country's deadliest human smuggling cases in recent history.
Up to 30 people are feared drowned in the second migrant tragedy in as many days in the Mediterranean.
Human rights groups are calling for an independent inquiry into the deaths of at least 27 migrants on the Spanish-Moroccan border.
Border externalization policies might keep refugees from reaching developed countries and staying there, but they don't stop people from taking the journey. What they do is they make the journey more dangerous. These policies force asylum seekers to take increasingly dangerous routes, to go to greater lengths to avoid detection on their journey. But this necessarily means that they're more difficult to protect. They have to turn to black markets more. they take treacherous paths through deserts and over oceans. And beyond this increase in danger is an increase in the chances of their fundamental human rights being violated. Refugees that are sent back to their home countries face violence and oppression. Those who are sent on to a third country often face a similar fate. When the US, Australia, the United Kingdom, or the European Union send refugees to a third country, they're washing their hands of responsibility. So let's call these policies what they are: violations of international law and attempts to escape responsibility. In many cases, the country trying to deny access to migrants and refusing to take refugees had a direct hand in the misery these people face in their home countries. This is certainly true of the United States and Central American migrants and migrants fleeing from Haiti. The United Nations conducted an investigation into the United Kingdom Rwanda policy, and they summed up the problems with this plan in a way that I think speaks to all border externalization policies pretty well. Quote, "This arrangement, which among other concerns seeks to shift responsibility and lacks necessary safeguards, is incompatible with the letter and the spirit of the 1951 Convention." The UK got called out. But the deal with Rwanda, it's far from the only border arrangement that fails to meet these standards. The fact is, these policies don't do anything to curb black markets, they don't protect refugees, and they don't stop migration. They just outsource human misery to places where people aren't really looking. There are no heroes in this story. I wish there were. No country has a perfect refugee policy based on internationally agreed upon standards, even if they should. But we do have a blueprint for how to do better. New Zealand took in hundreds of refugees that were trapped in Australia's Pacific Solution just a few years ago. Germany took in 1 million refugees during the Syrian crisis. It's clear that Western countries can do more. A lot more. And they can do it without sacrificing, well, anything at all.